Okay, welcome back. In this segment, I want to talk about some of the mitigating factors, and this is not as relates to mitigating radon. It's mitigating the perceived risk of radon. A couple of items that I want to point out. Now, the original EPA study that everybody refers to is one. That's the one where it says, that radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer. It is a scientific study. Those guys are very smart who did it, so much smarter than me, for example. But that study actually contained 18 pages of what they called, mitigating factors or, reasons why their conclusions were perhaps subject to some doubt. Now, we as the public are not given notice of those 18 pages, but at least they are included in the scientific study. Basically, bottom line is that the science was provided to EPA, who, you can decide whether they should have also provided those 18 pages of science to the rest of us. It appears to me that they decided just to feed us the information that they wanted us to understand without feeding us all of the science behind it. On one level, that can be understood. On another level, it seems perhaps untruthful. In any case, I'm going to go over some of the mitigating factors, just a couple of them. There's more in the article that I wrote, and there's quite a bit more that I will make available in the articles that I reference. They're on my website, which you are presumably at right now. So one of the key assumptions in the scientific study that was done to determine what level, if any, radon might have as far as health and safety effects is they said, all right, we're going to go find a group of people who were subject to a very high level of radon, and we're going to look at how much lung cancer they had, which on the face of it seems like a very reasonable assumption. But as always, the devil is in the details. What they found was a group of miners who happened to work in a uranium mine, and of course this was more than 50 years ago. And so as a result, the conditions were less than outstanding. You had a lot of dust. These miners were smoking heavily. There may or may not have been carbon monoxide going. There might have been minerals. There might have been actually physical uranium dust getting into their lungs. Uranium is a metal and it's heavy, but in a heavy, dusty environment, you can see where it's very easily understood that uranium could get into a set of lungs. So they didn't account for any of those in this study. They basically said, hey, here's a set of miners who were in a mine that had heavier radon concentrations, and here's how much cancer they got. So we're going to attribute all the cancer they got from the radon. And another thing they did is they used what's called the LNT, linear non-threshold assumption, which basically means this. Bottom line with that is, let's say, and I'm going to pull these numbers out of the air, so they're not science, they're just used for illustration. What they're going to say is, okay, if we had 10,000 miners and the radon level was 10,000 and 10% of them got lung cancer, then we can, using simple math, say, all right, if you have 10% of them at 10,000 got lung cancer, then if you drop the radiation level, say 10%, then you can assume that 10% less, or only 10% of the new population is going to have cancer. So basically, another way to explain that is that, if you got 1 million miners at a million that are dying, then if you have, using this linear non-threshold, you're going to assume that 100 will die at a level of 100. And, that is, oversimplifying and using numbers that don't mean anything at all. But what that really gets to is that there is no safe level of radon, which is simply an assumption. It's not necessarily based on science, but it is the assumption that was used in doing this study. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in one of the other segments. So they called the miners cohorts, and yes, they did get cancer. We're talking about 1960. Not all of them got cancer, but many. And just as a flavor to give you, I actually read an article on social media not very long ago where it talks about even today there are a number of slaves, and in this particular case, these are slaves that are in Africa, who are required to go down into these mines, and they're pretty much straight down, and they're hundreds of feet, and they may only be, 3 by 3. And these miners, they go down there and they work these mines, and it may not be uranium, whatever they're trying to mine. They send that stuff up, and the sounds inside these mines are the sounds of people coughing, because obviously they're in this very enclosed surface or enclosed area. There's dust, and this can't be good for the lungs, and they basically work these slaves until they die, and then they go buy another one and send them down the mine. Deplorable conditions. The reason I tell you that is because very similar deplorable conditions were used in the mines that are considered to be an example of the cohorts in the radioactive studies. So, as a matter of fact, those mines back in the day, they were called dog holes. So you get the picture of the conditions that might have been involved. And it's the guys that went into these dog holes that smoked and had all this stuff going on, as well as high radon concentrations. And this is the group that was studied as examples of what radon does to you. You can tell that, again, is a very conservative assumption. Another thing I would have you be aware of is that yes, I don't think anybody, any scientist, anybody from EPA, nobody's going to argue that high levels of radon can cause lung cancer. What is not universally agreed on is what does small levels of radon do? Then you get back to this linear non-threshold thing versus what's called hormesis, which basically means that as you get down towards normal breathing air, there are some studies that actually show that higher levels of radon, meaning in the 4 to 10 range, can not only be not bad for you, but some of the studies actually show that it can be good for you. Which, I'm sure you're falling off your chair right now, so let me say that again. There are a number of studies by reputable and respected physicists and guys that are in those sorts of positions. These are not the lunatics, but these are the people who are respected for knowing what they're doing, the university professors, etc., who have found that either there is no negative correlation, meaning no health effects at normal air no health effects at normal air for radiation or radon, or they have found that a little bit more radon can actually be healthy for you. You are not told that in any other circle besides me that I'm aware of. There actually are some websites, and again, I'll get you the links to those. Another thing I would have you be aware of, so I go back to where I told you that the large concentrations cause lung cancer. And, that's kind of an obvious statement. So then the question again goes back to, well, what does small levels of radon do to you? Let's look at some other materials. Large concentrations or large bodies of water can drown you. Small concentrations, maybe a couple of cups, will hydrate you. Similarly, I had a friend of mine, actually a cousin, who got into the food business, and he was working up in Idaho. And he told me one day that if a person ate a year's worth of potatoes in one day, the heavy metals would kill him. So it kind of follows along the same line. Obviously, we don't all eat a year's worth of potatoes in one day, so our chances of dying from potatoes, pretty small. But large quantities of potatoes in one day will kill you. Small quantities of potatoes in one day will feed you. So the discussion among scientists, not at EPA, but among scientists, is whether you actually really have any problem associated with radon at what is considered to be normal levels. Okay, next segment we're going to talk about the subject a little more, and we will be right back.